The day they drove me here, they told me it was for my own good, but all I heard was goodbye. My name is Beulah Ellis, 74. In the morning they said that lined the town wore autumn like a shawl. Gold light slid down the storefronts and across the hood of Daniel's SUV. Maple leaves turned lazy circles before settling on the windshield as if the season itself wanted to stall for me. The air smelled like wood smoke and damp apples, the kind of smell that makes your hands remember harvests. Daniel kept his eyes on the road and repeated that it was safer this way. He has always been the practical one. Crisp shirts, firm plans, the kind of man who believes a checklist can steady a heart. He spoke in that careful voice people use with a skittish horse. Laura sat in the back, tapping through emails, lips tight, with a meeting she would join as soon as she could find the Wi-Fi. She said the center had excellent reviews and that I would make friends. She added that my house had stairs and that stairs were statistics. Mark rode beside me in silence. He is the middle child twice over, always sliding between storms. When our eyes met in the mirror, he looked away and said we should focus on the positives. Maple Grove appeared at the end of a long drive lined with blazing maples. The brick glowed like a cooling ember. A fountain whispered in the courtyard, and the water held a scatter of leaves like small boats headed nowhere. Inside, the floor was clean, and the shine smelled faintly of lemons. A television murmured the morning news in a voice set to low comfort. A cart rolled by with oatmeal and cinnamon, and I felt hunger and grief bump shoulders inside me. Daniel told the receptionist that we had an appointment. He added that he had handled the paperwork because I get overwhelmed. Laura glanced at her watch and said we needed to be efficient. I nodded as if I agreed. In my head, another scene unspooled the kitchen 30 years earlier, when my hands were quicker and the table was loud. The roast clicked in the oven, the radio played soft Motown, and the boys used their forks like drumsticks until their father cleared his throat with fake thunder. We blessed the food without looking at the clock. Laura bragged about a spelling bee ribbon, and Mark tried to trade green beans for rolls. Daniel calculated slices to make sure no one was cheated fair down to the crumb. That dining room was small and everything fit. The laughter, the tired feet, the stories about scraped knees, the promises we tossed across the plates like little boats that always reached shore. I can still feel the heat that rose when I opened the oven, and the joy of announcing that the pie had set. In the admission office, the clock ticked louder than any church bell. The director smiled and explained activities therapy and a calendar studded with cheerful nouns. I heard the words and also heard the slow zipper of something closing. Daniel said Mom loses track of time and repeats herself. He said it kindly, like a headline he wished were not true. He looked at me as if the right look could make him less right. Laura pressed forms toward me and said it would help if I signed today. She said we were being proactive. She said she would stop by after work, maybe later this week. Mark touched my elbow and said this was temporary, just until we sorted things out. He said my safety mattered. He sounded like he was reading from a card someone else had written. I asked if anyone had asked what I wanted. The director folded her hands and said everyone wants the same thing, to feel secure. Daniel said I would thank them someday. We walked the corridor toward my room. Doors stood ajar like mouths about to speak. From one room came the clicks of knitting needles, from another, a cough that sounded like a branch breaking. My room was neat, and waiting bed made curtains open to a slice of blue. A vase held 3 sunflowers with their faces turned to the window. A new quilt sat folded like a promise that had not learned how heavy promises can be. Daniel put the suitcase on the chair and reminded me where the call button was. He said the move would be smoother if I did not try to pack more things. He said the house needed to be cleared before the end of the month. Laura placed a framed family photo on the dresser and adjusted it twice. She said I would be close to town, which would simplify visits. She said the staff was trained, which is a sentence you say when you do not want to think about tenderness. Mark set my sweater over the chair and stared at the pattern on the quilt. He said he would take care of the garden and that my peonies would not miss a season. He said he would call tonight. I tried on my new life the way you try on a pair of shoes at the store, walking a slow circle to see where it rubs. I touched the wall with my fingertips. I listened to the soft cartwheels and the softer sighs that float in places where days line up. They hugged me like people who are late. Daniel's arms were brief and firm. Laura's held a phone and a promise. Mark's lingered and then let go. I watched them walk down the hall, three silhouettes that used to tug at my skirt and now tugged at their calendars. I sat on the bed and counted my breaths until the door clicked. I thought about the smell of Sunday gravy and the sound of fork tines against heavy plates and a vinyl record that always skipped on the same lyric. I thought about the way boys become men while you are rinsing dishes. A nurse helped me find the dining room for lunch. She had kind eyes and the weary grace of someone who keeps showing up. She told me the soup was chicken and that the rolls came warm. I smiled and thanked her and kept the rest inside. There are things you carry close because they are the only steady heat you have left. There are things you do not say until the room is ready to hear them. The day they drove me here, I heard goodbye and also heard the click of another door opening far away. Last week, a lawyer called with news from California. My sister kept a secret, and now it is mine, and if I choose to use it, everything about this place and my place in it will change. A week after I arrived at Maple Grove, the phone in my room rang with a voice from another life. The lawyer's tone was measured, but the words spilled like light through a crack. My sister in California had passed and left me $6.8 million. I sat very still, tracing the armrest with my thumb, and let the number settle in like a seed looking for soil. That afternoon, I asked the front desk for the public records terminal in the library. The computer was slow but steady. I searched property filings and corporate registrations for Maple Grove and its parent company. I wrote down names, addresses, and filing dates in a small spiral notebook I kept under a stack of crossword puzzles. I learned the chain owned 3 facilities in Oregon, each under the same holding company, each leveraged with loans that made them vulnerable. At night, I called the attorney back and asked what it would take to buy them quietly. We spoke about trust shell entities and how to keep my name out of headlines until I was ready. His answers were precise, and I could almost hear him leaning closer when he realized I was not just a curious old woman, but a client with a plan. The days moved in their slow rhythm. Mrs. Powell, once a literature teacher, sat near the window with a stack of old essays she had saved. She would read aloud a paragraph and then stare into the air as if the chalkboard might reappear if she waited long enough. Across the hall, Mr. Harlan, a retired Navy sailor, told sea stories that smelled of salt and diesel. His hands shaped the air into waves and masts and storms that never touched the land. I listened more than I spoke. I kept notes on the worn carpets, the flicker in the fluorescent lights, the chairs in the common room with stuffing tired enough to sigh. I noticed which aides worked past their shifts and which ones vanished the moment the clock hit their hour. I counted how many residents had family visit more than once a month, and the tally was short. One Sunday, I stood at the edge of the courtyard and watched a family gather under a maple tree. A young boy chased leaves while his grandmother held his jacket like a tether. The parents poured coffee from a thermos and passed around muffins still warm. Their laughter carried across the grass, and something in me drew a straight line between that sound and the silence in my own room. That was the moment the plan set like concrete. Within a month, the trust had signed purchase agreements for Maple Grove and the two sister facilities. I walked the halls the next morning, knowing the floor beneath my feet was mine in a way no one here guessed. The first order I signed was for new lighting carpet and chairs built to last. The second was for a fresh coat of paint in colors that looked like dawn instead of dusk. The kitchen received upgraded equipment and a budget for fresh produce from local farms. The activity room got a piano tune for the first time in years. In the garden, I ordered benches placed under the trees and raised beds for vegetables. Then I wrote the new policy. Every resident would have the right to see their family at least once a week. Families who could not make that commitment would have visiting hours limited to the weekends, a rule meant not to punish, but to protect the time that mattered. I signed it with a pen that felt heavier than its weight. I kept my name off the memos and my face out of the staff meetings. The changes rolled out like quiet tides, lifting the place without anyone seeing the moon behind them. I walked the corridors at night, listening to softer laughter, smelling better coffee, feeling the hum of a place that was waking up. In the mirror, I looked the same, but under my skin there was a steadiness I had not felt since the house was mine and the children were small. I was no longer just a resident. I was the keeper of this space, and I was not done yet. The first call came from Daniel. The receptionist at Maple Grove told me later that his voice was low but sharp, each word clipped as if he were reading charges in a courtroom. He demanded to know who thought it was reasonable to tell him how often he could see his own mother. The next morning, an email from Laura landed in the administration inbox, 3 paragraphs of corporate outrage that accused the facility of abusing its authority. Mark never called or wrote, but when I saw him in the hallway, his jaw was set tight enough to ache. 3 days later, the administrator called me to her office and said the children had requested a formal meeting. The conference room was bright with tall windows and a polished table surrounded by leather chairs. A framed chart of Maple Grove's mission hung on one wall, a strategy map on the other. A pot of coffee steamed in the corner, its scent heavy in the still air. Daniel arrived first suit-pressed tie, knotted in the same way since his college interviews. He set his briefcase down like he meant to open it as evidence. Laura came next in a blazer over travel clothes, phone in her hand, thumbs busy until she looked up and saw me. Mark slipped in last hands and pockets, eyes scanning the room without landing anywhere. The administrator began to explain the new visiting policy, her voice, careful, her gaze moving from face to face. Daniel interrupted, saying this was an infringement on family rights. Laura followed her tone harder, asking who gave anyone the authority to decide when she could see her mother. Mark stayed silent, but his foot tapped under the table. I let them talk. Then I stepped through the door. The room shifted. The administrator moved aside. Daniel's mouth stopped mid-word. Laura's phone lowered until it rested in her lap. Mark's eyes finally landed, fixed on me. I walked to the head of the table and set down a folder. I told them that I was the chairwoman of Maple Grove and that the decision they were arguing about was mine. Silence held for a beat too long, the kind that shows how deep surprise can run. Daniel's brow furrowed as if trying to calculate the steps between what he thought he knew and what I had just said. Laura's eyes narrowed not in anger, but in a search for what she had missed. Mark's shoulders eased the smallest fraction. I explained that the rules were not meant to punish, but to protect the time we have left, that this place belonged to me now and the people in it deserved the kind of care that comes from more than routine visits on holidays. Daniel leaned back, his jaw working without sound. Laura blinked once slowly. Mark's hands came out of his pockets and rested on the table. When no one spoke, I closed the folder, stood and walked toward the door. In the hallway, residents stood in clusters. Some had been waiting, their eyes bright with something unspoken. As I passed, a slow ripple of applause began, soft at first, then gathering strength until it filled the corridor. I kept walking, the sound following me like a tide. At first, the visits came like clockwork because they had to. Daniel appeared every Sunday with the pie from the bakery. I liked placing it on the table as if to prove he had been there. Laura began shifting her travels so she could stop in twice a week, sitting by the window with coffee and a voice that softened as the minutes passed. Mark arrived every Tuesday evening, quiet but steady, never missing a week. As the weeks turned into months, the edges of obligation wore away. Daniel stayed long enough to help serve supper in the dining hall. Laura started bringing flowers for the lounge and staying to help with trivia night. Mark began lingering after dark, sometimes walking me to the garden just to hear the crickets. They no longer checked the clock. Conversations wandered. Laughter found its way into the corners of the room. One Tuesday, after the others had gone, Mark asked if we could sit in the lounge by the fish tank. The glow lit his face in soft gold. He told me he had stayed quiet during the conflict because his marriage was falling apart, and he was afraid that if he fought too hard for me, he would lose the last thing he thought he had left. He said he could not bear the thought of losing everything the way he believed I had. The words settled between us like a truth too late, but still worth knowing. I had believed their absence came from carelessness. Now I saw how fear can paralyze just as much as indifference. That knowledge did not erase the hurt, but it shifted something inside me. Late that summer, we found ourselves in the garden together, the four of us. The air was warm and scented with rosemary. Daniel poured lemonade into glasses while Laura set out slices of peach pie. Mark sat beside me on the bench, his shoulder against mine. We laughed at an old story, and the sound felt whole. The sun dipped low, painting their faces in amber light. I thought about how the past cannot be undone. It sits where it is unchanged. But what we do with what remains is ours to choose. And I choose love for the time we have left.